Hello, and welcome to Grand Final History. In this episode, we go back to 1943, the 47th season of the VFL, and the 5th season to be touched by World War II. Before we get to the footy, let's have a look at what was going on in Melbourne, Australia, and the world. The background to the season for the players, administrators, and the supporters. After 5 months of fierce fighting at Guadalcanal in the Pacific, US Marines were shipped to Melbourne and given 9 months recuperation leave, finding a home away from home. They were based at the MCG. They visited local families, and some even established romantic relationships with local women. The Marines were also central to one of the biggest brawls ever seen in this town, the Battle of Melbourne, between the Marines and the AIF 9th Division soldiers, which rocked Flinders Street on the 13th of February 1943. 3,500 soldiers, sailors and Marines battled, while MPs, Victorian Police and Mounted Police tried to restore order. The battle seems to have started from one or two individual fights, but lots of young men, resentment about the Yanks being overpaid, oversexed and over here added to the mix. Fortunately, despite the crowds, the bombardment of peaches, plums and other fruit from an overturned fruit stall, and attempts to overturn a prison van holding some of the arrested, there were no serious casualties. In an effort to smooth over tensions, a beer party was held at the MCG in March, where the Marines hosted the Australians, and all was well again. The Marines would ship out in October 1943. Their war was far from over. The 1942 attack on Sydney Harbour by Japanese submarines is well known, but less remembered is the sinking of the Australian Navy's hospital ship, the Centaur, in May 1943 off North Stradbroke Island, not far from Brisbane, torpedoed by a Japanese sub. Despite being illuminated with a red cross, it sunk in less than 3 minutes, with the loss of 268 of the 332 crew, including nurses, other medical staff, and field ambulance personnel. Avenge the nurses became a rallying cry for the remainder of the war. 1943 marked the turning point of the Second World War. The Allies became confident of victory. The time frame was not known, but the end result was. Key milestones included the surrender of the German army at Stalingrad at the end of January, the complete capture of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in February, robbing the Japanese of a strategic airbase and marking the end of their expansion. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March, with Australian and American air forces devastating a Japanese naval convoy. May saw the German army in North Africa surrender. Sicily was invaded in July. Mussolini was dismissed as Italian Prime Minister and arrested, followed by the invasion of Italy in September and the surrender of Italian forces. The Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, met for the first time in Tehran in November to map out the direction of the war in Europe. It had been a year of challenges and some setback for the Allies, but the momentum of the war was now clear. October saw the end of blackouts in Melbourne, which were first trialled in September 1941 in anticipation of war with Japan and made permanent on December 12, 1941, 5 days after the Pearl Harbor attack. But now, with success in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, the government was allowing light to return to the city. In Australian politics, the 1943 federal election saw John Curtin's Labor government returned in a landslide, with a majority, and both Enid Lyons and Dorothy Tagney became the first 2 women elected to federal parliament. The poor result of the United Australia Party in 1943 led directly to the formation of the Liberal Party. Victoria also had an election in 1943, and VFL Secretary, like McBrien, won a seat in the upper house of the Victorian Parliament, campaigning as an independent in the Melbourne North Province. Perhaps it was the campaign ads in the footy record that got him the votes. One event from 1943 might be looked at by the AFL as they prepare for their next grand final entertainment spectacular. While parachute displays have been a regular at grand finals for some decades, and, on occasion, the match ball has been delivered to the umpires by a parachutist. there is the opportunity to expand on this theme. In 1943, members of the British Eighth Army were completing a training exercise near the Sangro River in Italy. The paratroopers bailed out of their planes, landed without incident, folded their parachutes, stripped, and began to play a game of soccer. Now, why couldn't each grand final team arrive at the MCG by parachute? What could possibly go wrong? Let's focus on the footy now. As the year progressed, it became clear there were two strategic issues for football administrators to address. One, a plan for football in a post-war environment, and what would that mean for the VFL and the VFA? Secondly, how to deal with those footballers that had left the VFL, played for the VFA without a clearance, given many had spent time serving their country in uniform, and would football played for services team be added to their 3-year suspension? We'll have a look at both issues before getting into the 1943 VFL season. In April, J.M. Rowan, writing in the Sporting Globe, captured the mood when he said, "With the Allies on the road to victory, it is time that the legislators of Victorian football called a peace conference to end all football wars." Rowan's call for peace had been foreshadowed by the Australian Football Council at their meeting in Melbourne in February, which had called for one controlling body for football in each state. How the VFL and the VFA managed that potential opportunity was declared to be out of scope for the National Football Council and something for the VFL to address. Secretary of the VFL, Mike McBride, said he was unaware of any talk of a merger between the VFA and the VFL. He did support one controlling body for football to include the VFL, VFA, amateurs, public schools, suburban and country competitions, etc. But the present time was quite inopportune. By the end of June, the VFA was making moves to be ready for the 1944 season. The war may not be over. No final decision had been made, but it was time for the 12 VFA clubs to start planning a return. Grounds were being made available, and over 100 VFA players could return from the VFL, as per the 1941 Gentlemen's Agreement. Then in July, under a veil of secrecy that would suit a wartime operation, the VFL secretary, Mike McBride, set up an internal propaganda panel to discuss management of football in Victoria by the VFL in a post-war environment. There were two critical follow-up meetings in late November and early December. Of course, secrecy in league football administration is a nebulous affair, something to be approached rather than achieved, and it was not long before VFA President J.J. Liston was aware of the discussion. He made it clear that the association was open to the idea of an expanded competition with relegation and promotion, but he did not want to see any backdoor methods to bring this about. Liston also suggested a post-war focus should be on something larger than the cutthroat competition between the VFL and the VFA that was happening before the war. He could see that the post-war immigration would bring in new populations that favoured soccer rather than the local game, and football administrators had to be ready for this challenge. In the same article, journalist Hector Lacey also raised the threat of a Sunday competition to challenge the league. Wartime games by services team for fundraising had broken the sacred barrier that had previously made Sunday games impossible. Post-war, these old conventions might not hold, and many people who worked or played other sports on Saturdays would flock to Sunday matches, as already proven by the services games. Could the league or the association manage to fight off that challenge? As it happened, informal Sunday competitions were established in the late 1940s, and by the 1950s, 3 separate Sunday leagues were running, involving pub teams and other clubs. As recalled by Tommy Laird, they were a mix of professionalism and gambling, with crowds of up to 15,000. Despite the complaints of the churches, people wanted to watch football on Sundays. The illegal gambling resulting in match fixing was a bit of a problem, and the move by the VFA to play Sunday games, starting in 1960, ended up with the association owning Sundays for a couple of decades until the VFL moved into that space. But that's all for future episodes. In 1943, the VFL propaganda panel made some dramatic recommendations that could have had significant implications for the future of football in the state. Rather than maintain the current 12 teams, the VFL should expand to a two-tier 20-team competition, with the bottom two teams of the top tier being relegated and two teams being promoted. The additional 8 clubs would not necessarily be VFA sides, but rather selected according to a number of criteria, including wider metropolitan Melbourne reach, quality of grounds, quality of transport to grounds, expected post-war development. Not surprisingly, the delegates were shocked and split by such an ambitious plan. Representatives of the weaker clubs could see their teams relegated to Division 2, which might be a blow difficult to recover from. They suggested 2 regional conferences, to use a modern term, that would play the season, and the top 2 clubs would then play a grand final to decide the premiership team. Essendon's Ray Brew raised the VFA's rapid expansion before the war caused them to suspend operations in 1942. It was clear the league had to engage the association or be prepared to destroy it. In the December meeting, the league voted in favour of an expansion to 20 clubs, 16 votes to 6. But which expansion clubs was still not clear. Bob Rush, the veteran Collingwood administrator, National Football Council delegate, and league delegate since 1927, spoke up in defence of the VFA. I consider any action at this stage to transfer clubs from the VFA to the league would be considered in some quarters to be an unpatriotic act, which was a very significant phrase to use in a time of war. Rush went on to say, the VFA has stated it decided to cease playing football as a patriotic gesture. I agree the league must subscribe to a policy of populate or perish, but I consider the time inopportune for expansion along the lines suggested. Rush moved a motion that the issue of expansion be put back to the propaganda panel subcommittee, who would report back to the league. Rush had bought time to engage with the VFA, if they were willing to talk. Despite the vote to expand to 20 clubs, in the end nothing would be decided in 1943. But the stage had been set for significant conversations with the association in 1944. We'll see what happens in the next episode. So, if the VFA was going to return in 1944 and the VFL wanted to talk about a new post-war order with the association, what about those players who had left the league without a clearance, but then gone on to serve their country? Was the league able to bring itself to give men in uniform some kind of amnesty, now that the Allies were on the road to victory? Given the sacrifices made by those who signed up, could the VFL and clubs allow some mercy for the few? In April, Ron Todd, serving in the RAAF, went before the Collingwood Committee to ask that the Magpies sponsor a request to the league to allow him to return to VFL football. The Collingwood Committee stood firm in their stern no-forgiveness mode, deciding to take no action. Better to hold a grudge than see the return of a champion, or better to support your principles when a player has gone off chasing money. You decide which is the truth. It was probably a vain hope, as the Herald pointed out at the time. The 3-year ban for leaving without a clearance was a league rule, requiring a 75% majority to change. Would enough clubs be willing to see Collingwood get Todd and Fothergill back, or allow South to regain the services of Nash? While there may have been some amount of sympathy for the individuals, clubs were also looking to avoid giving advantage to the likes of Collingwood or South. Todd then combined with his mate Des Fothergill, who was in the army, to approach the league directly in May, requesting a wartime amnesty to lift the ban. But this just brought up the question whether services football should count as competition football within the meaning of the league rules, which would mean that the 3-year suspension would begin from the last services game that they played, leading to an even longer ban from VFL football. Despite subcommittee recommendations that services competition not add to the players' suspension, no final decision was made by the league We'll see what happens to these footy exiles in future episodes. The league started planning the season in January. Geelong would sit out the season again due to petrol rationing and transport challenges. There was some good news and some challenges when it came to grounds. Footscray's time at Yarraville was over as the Western Oval was now available. However, South Melbourne was having issues coming to terms with the Princess Park management on their second year away from the Lakeside Oval. While Richmond were happy to welcome Melbourne again on the same terms as last year, it was understood by South Melbourne that Carlton had intervened with the grounds committee and demanded special terms, much in excess of last year. The 1943 fixture introduced a unique feature for the VFL. Given the season would last 16 rounds, and there were 11 clubs, the league wanted to avoid the problem where some clubs got 2 byes and other clubs only got 1 bye. So the draw was announced for the first 11 weeks, with the club that was on the bottom of the ladder after the 11th round to be eliminated. Then the draw for the last 5 rounds of the season would be issued with no byes. There was some talk of allowing players from the eliminated team to transfer to other clubs for the remainder of the season, but it came to naught. Those players and their senior team would be out, even though their reserves team could keep playing. One club was going to achieve an unwanted historical record by being eliminated before the season was over. Richmond's Jack Titus is well known for his consecutive games record and goal-kicking skills, but in February 1943, he also rescued a pair of bolting horses on Punt Road. Seeing a soft drink wagon run past without a driver, he spun his car around, drove past the horses, stopped his car, and jumped onto the wagon as it sped past. After climbing over soft drink crates, he gained control of the horses and brought the runaway wagon to a halt before any people or horses were hurt. I wonder which of today's AFL players could perform a similar feat. Footballs were hard to get in 1943, with rubber for bladders only available in limited quantities. But some footballs were making their way to prisoner of war camps in Germany. The Sporting Globe told of a ball arriving at Stalag 18 in Germany, and despite already being confined to barracks at the end of the day, despite not having any boots or trousers, these were confiscated each night. The men picked sides, improvised rules combining Australian football, rugby and soccer, with players from all parts of the British Empire represented. They dived over beds, under beds and onto beds in pursuit of man and ball. The result of the match will never be known, but every man played until he was ready to drop. One small football breaking the monotony of life in a prisoner of war camp and a reminder of the real joy of football, regardless of the code. While POWs might have been playing their version of football, 1943 saw an American hybrid of Australian football played to appreciative crowds with some surprising results. The game was called Oztus, described by the American press as a high-scoring combination of soccer, basketball, and aerial bombardment. It started when Bill Jost, an American Marine who had won fame with his feats of ball throwing in various displays, declared they could beat the Aussies at their own game if they could throw the ball. Sporting Globe journalist Ern Cowley quickly drew up a set of rules. Basically, the Australian game with an American ball, throwing allowed, a 20-yard line in front of the goals, which you had to be outside of to score, and a limited interchange with 8 players on the bench. 5 games were played, the first at Punt Road in July, where the Americans beat the Explosives team from the Sunday Services competition. This got the Australians' attention, and on the 1st of August, at Princess Park, a strong Australian team took the field, with players such as Jack Titus, Fred Goldsmith, Tommy Leif, Les Meek, Vic Castles, amongst many other senior players. The Marines soon realised they were playing a better quality side than a services competition team, with the locals leading 60 points to 0 at quarter time and 92 to 6 points at half time. The Australian team might have slowed down at that point, or the Americans learnt a thing or two, because they outscored the Australians in the second half with a creditable final score of 115 to 78. An impressive effort from a pickup American team of Marines against some of the best players in the VFL, although most had played the day before. A third game was played again at Punt Road, where the Americans took on the premiers of the services competition, Ordnance, and the Yanks won. A fourth game was played in Geelong against a combined Geelong team, with several league players, including Tom Arkley, Lindsay White, who led the goal kicking for South Melbourne in 1942, and Jack Butcher. This was won by the locals, leaving the ad hoc series at 2 games all. The final Oz-Test match for 1943 was at North Melbourne against an explosives services team, and it was the Americans winning the game and bragging rights, 3 games to 2, with the 2 losses against teams packed with VFL players. While Ern Cowley and William Jost were awarded the Helms Athletic Foundation Medal by the United States-based foundation in 1943 for inventing the hybrid game, the early enthusiasm for international expansion of the code soon subsided, and Oz-Test is now just a vague memory. There is a short video of the game on YouTube. I'll put a link from the show notes so you can see how football looks when you can legally throw the ball forward. Clubs began training in April, a month before the season started, and while there were plenty of candidates, there was a dire shortage of footballs given the lack of rubber bladders. Collingwood painted their training balls white to make them easier to see on training nights and less likely to be stolen, but they still had one nicked in mid-April and posted a reward for its return. Footy during wartime brought plenty of challenges. There were only 2 coaching changes in 1943. At Fitzroy, it was the end of Dan Minogue's 20-year coaching career. Minogue's playing career started at Collingwood in 1911, and he captained the Magpies from 1914 to 16 before serving in the First World War. Minogue's playing career would cover Collingwood, Richmond, and 1 game at Hawthorn, with a coaching career that began in 1920 at Richmond and included stints at Hawthorn, Carlton, St Kilda, and Fitzroy. He won 2 premierships as captain coach at Richmond and was runner-up once, coaching the Blues in 1932 against the Tigers. A leader at 6 out of 12 clubs in the VFL across 20 years makes Dan Minogue's career one of the outstanding contributions in league history, demonstrated by the 27 VFL coaches who played under Dan at some time. One of the biggest numbers, if not the highest, of a coach producing coaches. The 2014 Grand Final Record did a great article on Minogue and the famous or infamous photo that Collingwood allegedly turned to face the wall when he left to captain coach Richmond. I'll put a link to it on the episode notes of the grandfinalhistory.au. His replacement at the Maroons was the club's fullback of the century, Fred Hewson, who would be captain coach. He had joined as a forward in 1938, but moved to defence, where he made his name. The other coaching change was at Footscray, where Norm Ware had been transferred north by the Army. So, ruckman Arthur Oliver took over. He had joined the Bulldogs in 1935, eventually playing for 16 years and holding the games record for the club before Ted Whitten took that honour. Arthur would coach the Bulldogs for 131 games, winning 68 and making the finals 3 times, evidence for how the club improved under his leadership. The season would normally have opened on Saturday, May 1st, but this was a no-race day and an austerity day with activities focused on the war effort, and the VFL decided to postpone the season and support the government's focus with a final round of practice games in something of a patriotic round, with funds going to the war effort. Most clubs played other VFL teams, which was unusual in this era. Practice matches were mainly intra-club affairs, with occasional games against country teams or VFA clubs. St Kilda played a Navy team. The following week, the season did begin, with 31 players making their debut out of the 190 men picked across the 10 competing clubs. All games paused for a minute's silence to honour the fallen VFL players. A sombre moment, followed by the last post that reverberated around hushed grounds. Everyone had family and or friends serving somewhere in the war. Most knew someone that had been lost or injured, and many of those playing would soon be heading off when their training finished. The match of the day was expected to be at Princes Park, where Carlton, who finished 1942 in such a rush but just missed out on the finals, were hosting the 1942 runners-up Richmond. 17,000 were at the game, but this was a blowout. The Blues all the way, winning by 44 points. Essendon unfurled their premiership flag at Windy Hill, in front of South Melbourne, and, despite a slow start, they took control of the game by half-time on their way to a comfortable win. The game was remembered more for the all-in brawl in the last quarter, with a large number of players who were joined by several hundred spectators jumping the fence. It took all the efforts of police, umpires, trainers, and a few of the cooler players to regain control after 5 minutes of turmoil. The Argus reported there was trouble carrying over from last year. This referred to an incident in the 1942 finals where Jack Basher Williams accused Ted Leane of causing a nasty gash, requiring 4 stitches to his chin. Now that was 6 months ago, and some players would be willing to let bygones be bygones, but not Jack Williams. There are also allegations from South Melbourne, denied by Essendon, of kicking. 2 Swans and 3 Bombers were reported, but perhaps many more could have been. North Melbourne travelled to Victoria Park, hoping for their first ever win at that venue in the 24 years that they had been at the league. They had yet to beat Collingwood at home. The Magpies were happy to have Jack Regan, considered by many to have been the best fullback ever, playing again. He had retired after the 1941 season, and the devout Catholic had spent 1942 as a lay brother in a religious community of Salesian brothers in Sunbury. However, he had enlisted in the RAAF, which meant that he was available for the Magpies while he was in training. He would be gone again, this time on RAAF service in 1944 and 45, before returning for 6 games in 1946, aged 33. Alongside his well-deserved reputation at full-back, he also wore 11 different numbers across his 196-game career, which is reported to be an AFL-VFL record. North were 3 goals up at three-quarter time, but a Jack Regan-led backline only allowed North 1 goal in the last quarter, while the Magpies got in front close to the end for a 4-point win. North returned to Arden Street, knowing the hoodoo had struck again. Fitzroy just beat Melbourne by 3 points, in what would be vice-captain and champion Jack Mueller's last game for the season. He was reported for using abusive language to the field umpire and suspended for 4 weeks, which wasn't going to be a problem. He was leaving on army duties and would play just a handful of games in the next 2 years when on leave before resuming his career after the war. Hawthorn had a surprise double, winning the first game of the season and winning away, both challenges for the teams from Glenferrie, beating St Kilda by 2 points. Footscray had the first bye. 56,000 people were at the 5 games, well down on the 100+ thousand of pre-war years, but well up on the 1942 season opening. The tribunal hearing on Tuesday night was tense. Essendon's Percy Bushby got 2 weeks. South's infamous Jack Basher Williams got 8 weeks for 6 different charges. During the evidence, it was said that Williams was challenging everybody in black and red. South's captain, Herbie Matthews, got 4 weeks. Sensationally, after the Matthews case, umpire Bride complained that Matthews had abused him outside the tribunal room. Bride said that he would withdraw a further charge if Matthews apologised, but he'd already left the building. The South Melbourne representative, Mr Farnham, apologised on Herbie Matthews' account, and all was smoothed over. There was talk of a boxing grudge match at Festival Hall, with the offer of a good purse, between Essendon's Percy Bushby and South's Jack Williams, who were both suspended. The league and the clubs were all strongly opposed, and it came to nothing. Well, at least, perhaps until the 2 clubs met again. The following Saturday, the Sporting Globe had an article about Richmond's Bill Cosgrove, who was serving in New Guinea flying Beaufighters. When told of the brawl at Windy Hill, he said, "It seems so silly when you view it from this distance, doesn't it? But the barrackers in the old town always take their football very seriously." Bill's plane had been named the Jack Dyer 4, being his 4th plane across campaigns in Libya, Sumatra and Java, and he had a tiger's head and "Eat 'em alive" emblazoned on it. He told Richmond to make an extra effort for the pennant this year and said he hoped to be wearing the old Guernsey after the war. Round 2 saw North kick 4 goals to 1 in the final quarter against St Kilda, but they just got a draw. Not as bad as losing the game, but still not a win for the Shinboners. Richmond was taking on long-time rivals Collingwood, which meant that Jock McHale was at the ground to see Richmond's full forward, Skinny Jack Titus, run onto the ground for his 192nd consecutive game, breaking McHale's record of consecutive games. Titus broke his nose in the win against the Magpies, But that did not stop him playing the following week. He would eventually play 202 games in a row, a record that would stand until taken by Jim Steins in 1998. Round 2, 1943, was also a critical milestone for the Hawthorn Football Club. Before the side took the field in the game against reigning premiers Essendon, Roy Cazaly, in his second year as coach of the club, told his players the Maybloom's name, so called because hawthorn bushes bloom in May in the Northern Hemisphere, was history. From now on, they would be known as the Hawks. Cazaly stood in front of the team and said, "I expect all players to live up to the name by being ready to fight hard to carry the ball with pace and dash to the goal." Cazaly had made the name change decision on his own, without telling the committee or seeking permission. The story ran that afternoon in the Sporting Globe and became a rallying cry as the season progressed, and the club has been known as the Hawks ever since. After 6 rounds, the season was more than 1/3 complete, and the ladder had a very unusual look about it. On top was Footscray, with 5 wins, showing their improving form in recent seasons was built on something sustainable. Fitzroy, under new captain-coach Fred Hewson, was second, also on 5 wins, after defeating the Tigers. Hewson had just played one of the best games in an impressive career, turning back multiple Richmond attacks with his strong marking. The Tigers did not help themselves, the ball hitting the post 3 times. The Maroons had started previous seasons well, but could they keep it going this year? Reigning premiers Essendon were third, followed by the newly named Hawks, both also on 5 wins, percentage alone splitting the top 4. Collingwood, with Jack Regan back in the team holding the defence together, was still managing without many of their better players. For example, in round 6, Fons Kine, Mac Holden and Ron Smith were all unavailable due to military service. Yet, the Magpies were now 5th on 4 wins, a significant improvement on the last couple of seasons. They were followed by Richmond and Carlton, both expected to rank high this season. Round 6 was hurting the Blues after losing to Essendon, who had kicked a goal just as the bell rang, although Essendon had created their own problems in that game by kicking 1 goal, 10 behinds, in the first quarter. North Melbourne sat in 8th spot with 2 wins and a draw, while St Kilda, South Melbourne and Melbourne filled the bottom 3 spots, knowing that whoever was last after round 11 would be putting away their boots early in this unusual season. While the VFL season was being played on every Saturday, on Sundays, a services competition was also being played for the second year, with the VFL providing umpires and officials and games being played on league grounds. The matches were popular, drawing good crowds. Many people in essential services jobs could not get Saturdays off, so a game of football with several VFL players in each services team was a welcome attraction, and admission fees went to patriotic causes, which mollified most religious types unhappy with anything but church as an attraction on Sundays. Most, but not all. League players would often play on Saturday for their club and Sunday for their branch of the services. Not all were happy about playing twice on the weekend, but if they did not play for their services team, they were afraid they would not get leave to play for their VFL club. Hard work on top of their military training. The services competition did provide issues for the league to address. We've already spoken about whether the games would cause players who had left without a clearance to have their return to the league delayed. In June, the league decided that if a VFL player was suspended by the services competition, the league would also bar them from playing. There was some frustration that the services competition was letting players who had been suspended by the league to continue to play. But the Army responded by saying football was a part of Army training and the matter of disqualification was a matter for the Army to consider. However, the league decided it would follow its own rules and recognise the suspensions on its side. Whether the Army's more relaxed attitude to suspensions had anything to do with them wanting their teams to win the services competition was not mentioned in the newspapers of the time. The league was again challenged by happenings in services matches in July, when a brawl occurred between 2 Army teams at the Brunswick Street Oval, and umpire Woolley, the league umpire, was struck by a player who had refused to leave the ground when ordered off, leaving the umpire with a badly cut and bruised lip. The opposition captain led his team from the ground, with the match being abandoned. there was a move for the league to stop supplying umpires to services games. This was avoided by the Army assuring the league secretary, like McBrien, that future services games would have adequate military police and sufficient senior officers in attendance to ensure officials were protected. In addition, the entire Army Workshops team was disqualified from the competition. The incident eventually found its way into the courts, where former Preston VFA player William Papworth was charged with the assault of umpire Woolley. The case was initiated by the Umpires Association to defend the principle that umpires should not be assaulted when officiating games. The case was proved, but Papworth gave evidence that he was suffering a nervous condition after being injured in a bomb blast while on service overseas with the Army. Umpire Woolley's solicitor suggested that given the principle of the issue had been established, there was no need for a conviction to be recorded. The magistrate agreed, but did note if Papworth had been a civilian, he would have been punished severely. The MCG had been off limits since early 1942, requisitioned for military duties, and now home to a large contingent of American Marines. However, on Friday, July 2nd, as part of the festivities leading up to the 4th of July Independence Day celebrations, the MCG was open to the public for a gridiron game between two US services teams for a cup provided by the VFL. The American game was, of course, preceded by an 80-piece marching band. Reviews of the game praised the Americans as makers of good coffee and quality companions in conversations. But their football did not impress with its delays and stops between small amounts of action. The Cannoneers did beat the Raiders 6-0, if you're wondering. I'll include a photo of the ground set up for gridiron and the marching band in the show notes for this episode at grandfinalhistory.au. Round 10 saw the newly named Hawks taking on Carlton at Princess Park. Leading into the game, Hawthorn was third on the ladder, one win ahead of the Blues. What made this game more notable that it was the third week in a row that Hawthorn had featured in the main game of the round. The first time this had happened since they joined the VFL back in 1925. Despite their previous good run of form, the Hawks lost by 25 points, but still held their spot in the four. Could they make the finals for the first time? Round 11 had three significant games. One was to decide top spot between Essendon and Fitzroy, both on 8 wins. The second was at the Lakeside Oval. South Melbourne were hosting St Kilda. Traditionally, this was the Lakeside Premiership, but this year the loser between 10th place St Kilda and 11th place Melbourne would be eliminated for the remainder of the season. This round meant that every team had played each other, and by coincidence, it was the bottom two sides playing in the 11th round. This was the elimination game. A third game of significance was Hawthorn looking for a rare win against Collingwood. We'll start with a simple one. Essendon was too good for Fitzroy, and they ended round 11 clear on top of the ladder. At Glenferrie Oval, Collingwood was a point up at three-quarter time. Roy Cazaly was furious. He was so disgusted he stood silent on the boundary line, refusing to talk to his players. The team huddled together. Who would give the three-quarter time address? Tommy Layev stepped forward and began to rev the players up, glancing across to another former Port Melbourne player, Andy Angwin. Tommy said loud and clear, "Look, we'll have to do it the Port Melbourne way." Andy knew what Tom meant, but the other Hawthorn players were confused. They asked Tommy, what did he mean by the Port Melbourne way? Tommy looked at them sternly, paused for a moment, and said, "We'll have to knock a few out. This is what we'll do. When they bounce the ball, I'll knock Albie Panham out." The players went back to their spots to start the last quarter. The umpire bounced the ball, and an unsuspecting Albie Panham found himself on the ground, felled by a hard Tommy Layev belt. Other Hawks followed Tommy's lead, and the Magpies were rattled. They tried to retaliate, but they just gave away free kicks, and the Hawks won by 4 goals, their second win against the Magpies. After the game, Cazaly still had nothing to say to his players. Club president Walter Jonah had a message for Tommy Layev, given his treatment of Albie Panham. Jonah said, "That's the worst thing that has ever happened at Hawthorn, Tom, and I have to tell you, I don't condone it." Tommy replied, "Neither do I, Doc, but we've beaten Collingwood, haven't we?" At the Lakeside Oval, South Melbourne were too good for the Saints. winning their second game in a row and consigning St Kilda to a very early exit from the 1943 season. Saints members could use their membership cards to go to any game in the 5 remaining weeks, but I suspected many of them would have retired for the season, just like their players. Given microwave ovens had not been invented yet, perhaps they had to settle for burning their membership cards. To complete an eventful round 11, North Melbourne upset Carlton, who went into the weekend 1 game out of the 4, assuming they would notch up a win and maybe make the 4 if Hawthorn's Collingwood hoodoo was maintained. But they spent Saturday night wondering how they had lost to North Melbourne and how could they make up a 2-game gap with just 5 rounds to go. This is what the ladder looked like after everyone had played each other once over 11 rounds. Essendon on top on 9 wins, a game ahead of the Tigers, Fitzroy and Hawthorn, all on 8 wins. 5th was Carlton after that shock loss to North. The Blues had a healthy percentage, but not enough wins to make the 4, unless something unexpected happened. Then followed Footscray and Melbourne, also on 6 wins. North was 8th, with 5 wins and a draw, which was better than many of their recent seasons, followed by Collingwood on 4 wins, and South, who, a couple of weeks earlier, had been last with only 1 victory, but 2 wins in a row got them above St Kilda, last with 2 wins and a draw, and the earliest winner of the wooden spoon across the entire history of the VFL-AFL. The following week saw a break in competition and the VFL play another Lightning Premiership as a fundraising effort for the Wall. Unlike the 1940 and 41 Lightning Premierships played at the MCG that had all 12 teams involved, the 1943 only featured top 4 teams and was played at Princes Park. The first 2 games were played in 2 20-minute halves with no time on, and the final was played in 25-minute halves. The first game saw Fitzroy defeat Hawthorn. Then Essendon beat Richmond. While not a memorable game for the Tigers in terms of results, it was the first time Frank Burke played with the senior team. He would make his official league debut in round 15 in a career cut short by war service and then injury. But this was the start of a famous dynasty that included his son, 4-time premiership player Francis Burke, and grandson David Burke. The next match was won by Essendon, beating Fitzroy to win the Lightning Premiership. In addition to the football, the crowd was entertained by an 80-piece US military band. The fixture for the last 5 weeks of the season was based on where the teams were on the ladder, with the top half playing each other, while the bottom half competed in their games. It meant no rest for the teams higher up the ladder, and the vagaries of ensuring that no club played more than 2 games in a row at home or away meant that some clubs competed at the same ground as in the first 11 weeks. It also meant that the top of the table Essendon had 4 home games, while Carlton, trying to make the final 4, ended up with 4 away games. The draw has never really been fair. In round 12, Carlton kicked a then record of 28 goals 10 against a struggling Collingwood at Victoria Park, which helped their percentage, and they were all smiles when they saw that Essendon had defeated Hawthorn. The gap to the 4 was only 1 game, and there were 4 rounds to go. The match of the day in round 13 saw Carlton hosting Hawthorn. The Blues were a goal down at 3/4 time, but a strong last quarter gave them a 22-point win. They were in the 4 on percentage, and the Hawks dropped to 5th. Round 14 saw the Blues travel to Windy Hill to take on Essendon. Yet another home game for the Bombers, but Carlton held on in a thriller, with only 16 fit men to win by 3 points. Hawthorn, after 2 disappointing losses, went to Punt Road to take on second-place Richmond. In one of their best performances since joining the league, they beat the Tigers by 5 points. Richmond received terrible news before round 15. Bill Cosgrove, who only got to play 3 games in 1940 before RWF service took priority, was reported killed in New Guinea. He had named every plane he flew after Jack Dyer, and the club honours his name on the trophy for the best first-year player. With 2 weeks to go, the 4 was far from finalised, and the upsets kept coming in round 15. After their loss to Carlton, Essendon were playing Footscray at the Western Oval. The Bulldogs had been second after round 8, beaten the Bombers earlier in the season, but they had fallen away, losing 5 games in a row before a win against North. Despite not being able to make the finals, they were too good for the Bombers. Second place Fitzroy, looking to lock in their first finals since 1924, were also beaten by traditional rivals Collingwood. Collingwood may have been the last of the participating teams on the ladder, but the Magpies always enjoyed beating neighbours Fitzroy. The ladder, after round 15, had Essendon on top, a game clear of Carlton, Richmond and Fitzroy and Hawthorn, all on 9 wins and a bye. Only percentage splitting second to fifth. The final round of the season had almost countless potential outcomes, and the top 4 teams were playing each other. Had the final started a week early? Essendon was a game clear, but taking on Richmond, who had a better percentage. If the Tigers lost, they could mathematically be replaced by Hawthorn, but that would require a huge percentage change. Fitzroy were hosting Carlton. Whoever lost could be replaced by Hawthorn. He just had to beat North Melbourne. At Punt Road, there was something missing, or more accurately, someone missing. After 204 games in a row, the Tigers ran out onto the ground without Jack Titus, who had injured his ankle in the previous week's game against Melbourne. Despite the absence of their champion full forward, Richmond won the game comfortably. The Tigers would be on top of the ladder. Essendon had to wait for the result between Carlton and Fitzroy. It was a close game, yet the Maroons did lead for most of the day to win by 15 points. Not enough of a win to take second spot, but they were happy with third. A reward for their loyal supporters with a return to finals football. Now Carlton had a nervous wait, so it was down to Hawthorn and North at Arden Street. Hawthorn's most important game in 19 seasons of VFL football, against one of the other VFA clubs that made the move back in 1925. Sometimes pressure focuses a team, and sometimes it robs a team. The Hawks seemed to have got stage fright against an opponent that had spent the season near the bottom of the ladder. Hawthorn did not score a goal in the first half. 8 scoring attempts for 8 behinds. 4 goals down as they left the ground at half-time. Roy Kazali did not use the silent treatment this time. The Hawks were fired up and kicked 6 goals straight to trail North by just 3 points at the last break. Surely now they had the momentum and they would go on with the game. Instead, the Hawks got the yips, kicking 1 goal, 8 behinds, and 4 out of bounds in the final term. Trailing by a point in the dying moments of the game, Tommy Laeth implored his teammates just to rush the ball over for a behind, but they kept it in play, attempting the goal that would win the match. Tommy knew a draw would be enough to get past the loser of the Carlton-Fitzroy game, but the bell rang. North had another win for the season. Many Hawks supporters and officials noted that they could have done with key forward Wally Colpert. He had kicked 43 goals in 13 games, but the RAAF had sent him into state before this fateful game. Perhaps he might have kicked more accurately. That was the challenge with players in wartime service. Hawthorn had missed out on the finals when it was theirs for the taking. Or had they? For a time after the game, the Hawks thought that there might be a chance they could still sneak into the finals. Rumours had been running wild that North Melbourne's last-minute inclusion, Michael Pullen, was not a registered player. North would have to forfeit the game, and the Hawks would win. It might have been an unusual win, but it would get them into the finals. But no. By Monday afternoon, all had been confirmed okay. Pullen had been registered back in 1940. Hawthorn officials admitted they were glad the situation had been resolved. They had investigated the rumour to satisfy members, but they were relieved they were not going to enter the finals under protest, as disappointed as they were by the loss on Saturday. It was Mick Pullen's first game in North. He would play 3 more games in 1946 after his time as a pilot in the RAAF, including an amazing escape when his plane crashed in the Bay of Bengal, and he and a nose gunner were the only survivors, rescued after spending 14 hours clinging to wreckage just to stay afloat. One story of many by those who served. Yet, it turns out, Hawthorn were done a disservice. At the League Permits Committee in October, it was proved that Harry Chalmers, the other player that was under an eligibility cloud, was residentially tied to Footscray, and his permit to play with North Melbourne was revoked. North Melbourne were cleared of any blame in the affair. They had relied on the permit granted by the league. Perhaps if Chalmers had provided his correct address, he would not have taken the field in that final game of the season, and perhaps Hawthorn would have won and played in the finals. But it was not to be. Hawthorn had missed out, and Chalmers would play for the Bulldogs in the next 2 seasons. It had been the Hawks' best year in the VFL, but all they had to show for it was their first Almostest award for just missing the finals. Footscray finished 6th on 7 wins, as did Melbourne, 7th on the ladder. South Melbourne picked themselves up off the bottom of the ladder just at the right time to avoid elimination and entered the season well. 6 wins got them 8th spot. North had 5 wins and a draw, a good year for them, but just 9th spot, ahead of Collingwood, who had another tough wartime season, leaving them the last of the active teams, but it was St Kilda, 11th, who had already taken the wooden spoon. Both semi-finals would be a replay of round 16. In the first semi-final, Carlton taking on Fitzroy, but this time at the Blues' home ground, Princes Park, with the MCG off limits during the war. Followed by a second semi-final, Richmond versus Essendon, for a place in the grand final. There was no Brownlow in 1943. It had been suspended in 1942 and would not return until after the war. Fitzroy were declared favourites by the Sun, while the Herald went with the Blues for the first semi-final. Carlton made 5 changes to their team, while Fitzroy made 2 changes. Leo Monaghan returned to the back line from services duty, but Dan Murray, father of Kevin Murray, was out due to his military service, replaced by Norm Hillard. That was a challenge during the war. Clubs never knew which players would be available week to week. Nearly 40,000 were at the first semi, played in fine conditions, with many neutral supporters boosting the crowd far above the previous season's first semi-final. But only Fitzroy supporters enjoyed the game, or, more accurately, the thrashing of Carlton. The first quarter seemed close on the scoreboard, with only 2 goals separating the teams. But after the break, everything went the Maroons' way. They dominated, while Carlton played one of their worst ever games. It became more like a training run for Fitzroy, and some of the reviews wondered if the ease of the win made it difficult to judge how good they really were. There was no denying the final result, 13 goals 16-94 to just 5 goals 13-43. The second semi-final was on Saturday the 11th of September. The winner would go into the grand final, the loser would play Fitzroy in the preliminary final. While Essendon had finished second, they had lost the last 3 games of the season against Carlton, Footscray and Richmond. Hector Lacey in the Sporting Globe said, on recent showing, if Dick Reynolds was to drop out of the side, it would break up into a rabble. Essendon supporters could point to the unusual draw for the last 5 games that saw the top sides all playing each other and hope that things would be right in the finals. The Bombers went into the second semi with injuries to Dick Reynolds, thigh, Zach Russell, broken hand, and Wally Buttsworth, thigh. Despite their injury woes, Essendon kicked 4 out of the first 5 goals. Yet the Tigers pulled themselves back into the game in the second quarter with only 4 points between the team at the long break. The third quarter was dominated by Essendon, kicking 6 goals despite the wet and slippery conditions, and this was enough to win the game and propel them into their 3rd grand final in a row. 4 goals to an 18-year-old Keith Rawle hurt the Tigers. Rawle's enlistment with the RAAF meant the grand final would be his last game until 1946. Dick Reynolds was again judged by many to be best on the ground, moving from attack to defence as the game required. On the Tuesday before the preliminary final, the injured Jack Titus was in charge of training, while Jack Dyer was appearing as a witness at the tribunal, given Essendon's Elton Plummer had been reported for striking Dyer in what must have been one of the many unprovoked attacks on the Richmond captain during his long career. After training, Titus took the players to his Richmond pub for a treatment that is no longer part of the modern player management, but obviously made sense at the time. Maybe it was part of the reason why Jack Titus played so many games in a row. The players lined up, and each man received a spoonful of laxative syrup. It was to clear them out for the Saturday. Fitzroy had beaten Richmond 3 times in 1943, twice in the home and away season, and once in a pre-season patriotic fundraiser game. Yet the Herald still tipped the Tigers to win. Richmond were not leaving anything to chance, and decided to copy a tactic Fitzroy had employed against Carlton, of obtaining advice from former players. Jack Dyer welcomed the concept and seconded his former mentor and 4-time premiership coach, Frank Checker Hughes, who had led the Tigers as coach in their 1932 premiership before establishing a dynasty at Melbourne with 3 flags in a row. Also helping out was dual premiership player Jack Baggett, who had also coached Essendon before Dick Reynolds took over. Hughes and Baggett joined Dyer in addressing the players before the game. Baggett reminded players of the famous men that had worn those numbers in previous years, while Hughes focused the team on the impressive leader they had in Dyer, and if they followed him, they would win. 27,000 were at the game, and Fitzroy supporters were feeling good at half-time. They had waited so long to get back to finals action, and now, in the penultimate game, they were 3 goals up against a team they had already beaten 3 times this season. But that was as good as it got. The Tigers had started the game slowly, but after half-time they took control, kicking 4 goals to 1 to level the scores at three-quarter time, and 5 more in the final quarter, giving them a 4-goal win. It was a result Richmond wanted, but they knew they could not afford to play half a game if they were to beat Essendon in the premiership match. St Kilda supporters might have taken some small comfort on preliminary final day. While their seniors had been eliminated after round 11, their reserves made a back-to-back premierships at Victoria Park. They beat Fitzroy, giving that club a day they would prefer to forget. But perhaps a preliminary final for the seniors and a grand final for the reserves gave some cause for hope of better times after so many seasons of struggle. Jack Dyer was leading the Tigers as captain-coach and desperate to make up for the bitter loss to Essendon in the 1942 grand final. He took every measure he could to achieve success. Continuing to consult with Checker Hughes and Jack Baggett, Dyer made sure they both had seats on the fence at Princes Park to provide any necessary advice. Perhaps a coaching panel before coaching panels existed, at least for this vital game. One key tactical decision designed to stop Dick Reynolds was using his 18-year-old cousin, Max Oppie, as a tagger. While Oppie and Reynolds were cousins, the families were not especially close, but Max did grow up barracking for Essendon because of Reynolds. However, now willing to run through brick walls for the Tigers, nothing was going to stop Max Oppie doing all he could do to stop Reynolds, even if that meant being a little physical. One of the many famous stories about the 1943 grand final build-up was Jack Dyer warning his players anyone caught drinking in the week leading up to the game would be out of the Richmond team forever. The following morning, Dyer walked into a city hotel and saw 3 of his best players, Jack Broadstock, Bert Edwards and Bernie Waldrum, drinking pots of beer before 9 a.m. Dyer knew he could not afford to lose all 3 players before the grand final. He made a strategic retreat before they saw him. However, at training that night, all 3 players were given extra drills after all the other players had headed into the rooms. They knew they'd been caught, and they paid the price. The umpire for this game was Eric Hawkins for his 3rd grand final in a row. Well known for his wagging finger, emphasised by his whistle with its brass band, used to admonish unruly spirits, leading to accusations by some of unnecessary theatricality. To prepare himself for the weekly challenge of controlling VFL games, Hawkins would train for 3 hours on a Tuesday, attend umpiring school on Thursdays, and on Sunday, after the game, he would seek out the hot sea baths and massages. Then, as now, there was no shortage of critics of umpires, and some wondered why they were paid so much. But those critics probably didn't think about the umpires paying for their own uniforms, paying for a trainer and massage oil for all those much-needed rub-downs, buying meals on training nights and paying their own way to attend tribunal sessions. It was not an easy job, and Hawkins' 3rd grand final was a fitting reward for his efforts over the season. There were no changes to the Essendon team from their semi-final, nor from the Richmond team that won the preliminary final. However, given both teams were playing their 2nd grand final in a row, it's worth looking at how the sides had changed in 12 months. Richmond's 1943 team only had 9 men that played in the 1942 grand final. Into the team were 9 new players, including Max Oppie, Bill Perkins, Leo Maguire, Arthur Barr Kemp, Laurie Cale, Jack Broadstock and Ray Hunt. Not sure if that's a record turnover for back-to-back grand finals, but it's got to be up there. 3 of the new players were from South Australia. Laurie Cale and Ray Hunt were in Melbourne on military training, and the Tigers had swooped. Cale, from South Adelaide, was the uncle of legendary Port Adelaide star John Cale. He would only play 7 games for the Tigers, and Ray Hunt from Glenelg only played 6 games. but both provided great value. One of the pivotal players for Richmond was a man Jack Dyer rated as one of the best he'd ever seen. A player the Sporting Globe said was one of the best South Australians we have seen in Victoria for years. A player whose name is little recognised now. A player who could do almost anything with the ball, who was years ahead of his time with the use of handball, and a man who almost beat Victoria on his own when he was playing for South Australia in 1941. John Harmon Broadstock, better known as Jack Broadstock, was an extraordinary footballer, charismatic and talented. However, he was also a lair, a conman, a gambler, a crook who would eventually end up doing prison time. And he was something of an enigma. He had moved from Adelaide at the end of 1941 and was working in a munitions factory. It took 3 attempts to get a clearance from West Glenelg, but on July 29 it finally came through, and he took to the field in round 13 for the first of his 6 games in 1943 for the Tigers. In his biography, Dyer also included a story about Broadstock that has become part of the history of the 1943 Grand Final, repeated in most tales about that season. Dyer said that Broadstock had gone absent without leave from the army and the military police were on his trail. Desperate calls from Dyer to his colonel were required to get him permission to play the game. The only problem with this story, as identified by Michael Sexton in his book The Trials of Jack Broadstock, was the fact that Broadstock had been discharged from the army in 1941. He had missed his troop ship transport out of Australia and was lucky to be found not guilty of desertion, but was convicted of being absent without leave. After a fine and 30-day detention, his time in the army was up. Broadstock was trouble, no doubt, and was quite likely to be involved in gambling and other affairs that might have gained the attention of police and possibly military police if it involved enlisted men. So, as Sexton points out, the story of Broadstock being absent without leave around the grand final was not possible. But perhaps Dyer, himself a police officer, had changed some of the details of whatever trouble Broadstock found himself in, perhaps protecting those who allowed him to play in the big game in 1943. We may never know. Essendon was a far more settled club during the war years, but still had 5 new players compared to their 1942 team. Jack Cockburn, Les Gardner, Keith Rawle, Norm Betson and Gil Langley on the bench, who would make more of a name for himself as a wicket-keeper for the Australian cricket team. Gil would get to know Richmond's back pocket player in the years to come. Ray Steele, as well as playing 42 games for Richmond, would also go on to become president of the Victorian Cricket Association and spend 16 years as treasurer of the Australian Cricket Board. 49,000 were at Princes Park, and many of them had struggled to get to the ground, with the Herald reporting chaotic scenes at the Elizabeth Street terminus as an unruly crowd of football supporters and punters trying to get to Moonee Valley were converging on trams from 11:30am. By 12:30, every tram was packed beyond capacity, with as many as 20 men, women and children riding on the narrow footboards, some almost hit by trams approaching from the opposite direction. Others piled into the rear driver's cabin and more hanging off the back of trams. 20,000 people were transported by trams alone that day. Things are a little bit more controlled in our modern era. With the Reserves Grand Final having been played a week earlier, the curtain raiser was the Boys League Championship. A thrill for the boys to be playing in front of such a large crowd on this important occasion, appropriately between the Essendon Stars and the Richmond Imperials. In a tightly contested game, it was the Essendon Stars who won the day by 1 goal, 12 goals 13 to 11-13. But was that an omen for the senior premiership? Jack Dyer won the toss and chose to kick with the wind. Dick Reynolds went back to his playing group with one final message. Keep your heads down when the Tigers dish out the rough stuff. Essendon was fitter than Richmond and they could run them out over the game. Richmond started strongly and kicked 4 of the first 6 goals to lead the game by 10 points at quarter time. Essendon started better in the second quarter and goals to Keith Rawle and Tom Reynolds got them back in front. The Bombers were playing with confidence and the speed out of the centre was proving the difference early on. As the quarter went on, and with the efforts of Dyer in the ruck and Dick Harris up forward, it was the Tigers back in front at half-time by 8 points. Dick Reynolds was providing some drive, but under the physical blanketing of Baxopi, he was not his usual dominant self. Could he be held down for an entire game? Reynolds and the Essendon selectors reviewed the game at half-time and made some key moves, looking to catch Richmond off guard and provide a different focus up forward. Hugh Tawney moved out of the ruck and into the forward line. Jack Casson went from full forward into the centre. Some spectators might have questioned the wisdom of these changes, but they were cheering the brilliant move when Tawney scored a goal just minutes into the third quarter. Dick Reynolds then passed to his brother Tom, who kicked truly and followed that up with his second goal for the quarter. It seemed that the grand final tide was flowing in Essendon's favour. Moments later, it was blood that was flowing. Reynolds emerging dazed from a pack with a nasty cut above his eyes. Trainers rushed to assist him, but Reynolds knew that the game was in the balance. He grabbed a towel to staunch the wound and played on. No blood rule in 1943. He was clearly suffering the effects of the blow. Moments later, he had a shot for goal, one that he would normally slot through, yet the kick went astray. Reynolds' influence on the game diminished after that incident, with Max Oppie able to move from a purely defensive mode to making the play. Years later, Max Oppie described the incident saying, "He snuck into my fist. I did what I was supposed to do. I put him out of the game." Oppie also said that if that sounds brutal, it wasn't. It was football, and there were never any hard feelings between Dickie and me. As Reynolds' role in the game faded, Richmond's Dick Harris became more dominant. Jack Titus may not have been playing, but Harris kicked his fourth goal just after the knock to Dick Reynolds, and Richmond were right back in the game. With his brother struggling, Tom Reynolds lifted his game in the forward pocket, becoming such a threat that Jack Dyer moved himself onto Tom to stop his goal scoring. Late in the third quarter, they flew for a mark. Jack got his hands on the ball, but Tom plucked it out, claimed the mark, and umpire Hawkins agreed. Jack admitted to saying, "I'd kill him before I'd let him do that again," but he couldn't stop Tom kicking the goal. The Dons cleared the ball from the centre, and Jack Casson passed the ball to Tom, who marked on the behind post just as the bell rang. He took his shot from the impossible angle, trying to give his team a 10-point lead, but it went through for a behind. Essendon in the lead by 5 points, 1 quarter of football to go, as described by former Premiership player Gerald Brosnan in The Sun. The final quarter was a thriller. Dyer took a strong mark, then kicked straight to get the Tigers in front. Then Dick Harris, having a day out in the biggest game of the season, kicked another, putting Richmond 8 points up and looking like they had some momentum. But Essendon were not stopping. Gordon Lane kicked truly, cutting the lead to 2 points, and supporters from both sides were urging their team on in the closest grand final for years. Richmond again surged forward with goals to Dyer, playing a captain's game, supported by Harris, a booming drop kick for his 7th in the game. At the other end of the ground, Tom Reynolds was doing all he could to win the game for the Dons and his brother. He kicked his 7th, and ruckman Hugh Tawney got another. The difference was just 4 points. Into time on in the final game of the season, and less than a goal separated the two best teams of the year. The Tigers got the ball back into their forward line and could have sealed the game with Arthur Kemp's shot missing and Dick Harris, looking for his 8th goal, scoring a behind. Richmond was 6 points up. A goal by Essendon could see the league's first ever drawn grand final. Dyer packed the back line, but couldn't stop Essendon ruckman Norm Betson taking a mark and lining up for a shot on goal. Would they be back here next week? Crowd was silent. They knew there was just moments to go, and a ruckman was having a shot at goal, perilous at the best of times, desperate when a premiership depended on it. Betson could feel the nerves, drew a breath, and took his shot. Screams flew up from the crowd. He'd kicked it into the man on the mark. Yet, in a blur of movement, Norm Betson gathered up the rebound and kicked the ball high towards the goals. It looked like it might go through. But Jack Dyer was there, leaping with his fist extended, this time punching the ball, deflecting it through for a behind, just as the bell rang out across Princess Park. The Tigers had done it for Bill Cosgrove. They'd done it to make up for the loss a year earlier. They'd done it for the supporters and the club, and they had done it for Jack Titus, who had played 294 games for the Tigers, but an ankle injury in round 15 meant that he was not on the ground for this triumph. They had done it for themselves, and they had done it for their captain, Jack Dyer. They were the premiers. In an extraordinarily tight game, Dick Harris kicked 7 goals for Richmond, while Tom Reynolds scored 7 for the Dons. Only 3 players have kicked more in a grand final. Reynolds came over to the Richmond change rooms, and unlike Jack Dyer's bitter rant after the 1942 grand final, he was calm and willing to congratulate the better team on the day. Reynolds was also full of praise for Dyer when interviewed by the Herald after the game. He said Jack Dyer won the game for them. Jack Dyer wrote in his biography that this is what he didn't like about Reynolds. No killer instinct. But I think that's both unfair on Reynolds, who knew how to win games, and it said probably more about Dyer's dramatic biography, where he was possibly playing up to the character of Captain Blood, rather than what Jack Dyer really felt about his worthy opponent. After the game, Jack Dyer said it was his proudest and most stirring moment. Richmond players celebrated with a dinner at Punt Road, with many guests, including Australian and American officers. The Mayor of Richmond declared they would fly the 1934 centenary pennant from the town hall for a week to mark the wonderful occasion. Jack Titus announced his retirement, but he would remain with the Tigers in many different roles, even stepping in to coach the club when Len Smith became ill in 1965. The Tigers continued their efforts to raise funds for the war efforts, with a match against an RAAF team in Bairnsdale the week after the grand final. It was a friendly affair, with many experienced players in odd positions and some youngsters given a run. Jack Titus spent 3 quarters experiencing life as full-back before being a reprieve at full forward. Titus held the RAAF full forward to just 1 goal, and the Tigers' regular full-back, Ron Durham, enjoyed his time at the other end of the ground, kicking 4 goals. As 1943 came to an end, there was increasing discussion on the likelihood of Geelong returning to the VFL, as the number of people working in essential services was at sustainable levels, and transport to and from Geelong could be managed by slight changes to rail timetables, or even vehicles powered by charcoal gas burners, a common method used to replace petrol. Such a move would mean up to 15 Geelong players who had served with other VFL clubs would return to the Cats. South Melbourne alone would lose 6 players, including gun full forward Lindsay White. We'll leave 1943 there. The Tigers had their premiership. Geelong might be returning in 1944, but as we know, the war still had a long way to go. Perhaps we'll leave the last word to Jack Broadstock, one of VFL football's more unusual characters. He may have only played for 2 seasons, and Jack Dyer had no hesitation in describing him as the most talented footballer he'd ever seen. But Broadstock was also a drinker, a gambler, a bookie, a schemer, banned from racetracks and sentenced to jail. And yet, despite his more troublesome traits, he knew the game like few others. Decades after his time at Richmond, he wrote a letter to Alan Schwab at AFL head office. It was unearthed by Rhett Bartlett in his retrospective Twitter account. In the short note, written about 1991, he told Schwab he had seen the best footballer ever, a 16-year-old. Whoever you barrack for, he's going to be a world beater. Jack Broadstock had done plenty of things wrong in his life, but he knew football. The player he wrote about would represent South Australia 5 times, win a Brownlow, earn 8 All-Australian selections, 3 Malcolm Blight Awards as Adelaide's best and fairest player. He would play in the 1998 Adelaide Premiership and was inducted into the Australian Football Hall of Fame in 2011. Perhaps not the best ever player, but spotting the potential in a 16-year-old Mark Prosciutto was a pretty good get for Jack Broadstock, a man who also showed a bit of potential. If you've enjoyed Grand Final history, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook or Twitter or Blue Sky for more Grand Final history.